What if we told you that what you thought was far away was actually very close, or what you thought was small was actually huge? Turns out, this topsy-turvy world actually exists somewhere between American and German varying perceptions of size and distance. So who has it right? And how could they be so different?
Hey guys, and welcome back to our channel. I am Donnie.
And I'm Aubrey.
And we are two Americans currently living in Germany and sharing all of our experiences living and traveling throughout Europe. One of our famous lines in every video that you all have started to comment on more and more regularly is when we say we come from a small state in the southern US called Oklahoma. Well, how small is Oklahoma really? Or is it just that between the US and Germany, we have completely different concepts of what small really is? One thing we have definitely learned living in both countries is that one thing considered big in one country might be considered small in another. And that is exactly what we are going to talk about today in our video. Size doesn't matter, but between Germany and America, which would you rather?
So here it is again. We are from a small state in the southern US called Oklahoma and now live in the southwestern German state of Rhineland-Pfalz. Both of these places have their own unique subcultures and perspectives that may not be representative of the two countries as a whole. Therefore, let us know your experiences with these things in the comments below and where you're from. Also, if you're from a different country than these two, we want to hear about what these things are like where you live.
All right, we keep mentioning it, so let's get to the bottom of it. Is the state we are originally from actually small? Honestly, Oklahoma is actually probably not even considered very small in the US, as it ranks 20th on the list of state sizes from largest to smallest. However, it does seem dwarfed when compared to our famous neighboring state of Texas, where they famously claim everything is bigger in Texas. And I guess they have to say in Texas, because in fact, Texas isn't America's largest state, but rather second place to Alaska, in which 9 Oklahomas could fit inside. However, you could fit 58 of the US's smallest state, Rhode Island, inside of Oklahoma.
But by German standards of size, where does Oklahoma stand? Well, based on our perspective on the world, because we grew up in the US, and to us, the US was an average sized country, we didn't initially figure it was fair to compare a state size to an entire country's size, especially when that country also is made up of states like the US. So how does Oklahoma compare to our new state of Rhineland-Pfalz? Well, Oklahoma has a total land area of 181,037 square kilometers, whereas Rhineland-Pfalz has a land area of 19,854.21 square kilometers, roughly 10% of the size of Oklahoma. So it is actually more fair to compare the size of Oklahoma to Germany, and when we do, we find Oklahoma is actually half the size of the entire country of Germany. Germany does have a population of about 83 million compared to Oklahoma's almost 4 million. So population density is also completely different between these two places. But this is just the start of us seeing how our concepts of size are completely different than a German's concept of size simply because of where we were raised and what we were used to growing up.
The US is the 4th largest country in the world in land area, and because of that, there were some things that were normal to us to consider in our everyday lives we didn't realize may not be completely normal to the rest of the world, like in Germany. In a previous video, we talked about the big difference in the US, where we had never used a country code in a phone number before because we never made calls outside of the country considering the size of the US and our distance like many Americans from any other foreign country. This is different from Germans, where they normally do include the country code in a phone number because they regularly will make calls outside of Germany. Well, there is the other difference of making calls in the US, in which it is normal to have to do the math in our heads to figure out what time it is at the place we are calling and if it is reasonable for us to call at that time. This is a very common thing we have to think about as we call our family and friends in various parts of the country that live in different time zones. The US is actually spread out across 6 different time zones: Hawaiian Aleutian, Alaskan, Pacific, Mountain, Central, and Eastern Standard Time Zone. It is also very common that US TV shows will announce the times they come on by listing out all of the different time zones, or simply they will just do Eastern and Central, and then the other time zones have to do the math to figure out what time it will come on for them based on those.
However, in Germany, this is not the case. Germany falls in just one time zone, Central European time zone. Now, Europe as a whole can get a little complicated with multiple time zones, with countries that observe daylight savings time or not, those that are choosing summertime or wintertime. But what we are strictly talking about here is the mindset of what we are used to domestically. Therefore, when a German may want to call their family or friends also in Germany, they just simply call them without even thinking about it possibly being a completely different time zone. Because of this, German TV shows also just announce when they will be airing without having to include multiple different time zones like we're used to seeing in America. For our European audience though, how often do the different time zones affect your lives? For example, we have family and friends in nearly every time zone in the US, so we do think about it very often and sometimes weekly as we call certain people. Are the European time zones something you often have to think about as well, or just occasionally for maybe like business calls? You know, Donnie, there is something for Germans and Americans alike that is not that far away and we both can agree on. And that is an awesome online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes brought to you by Skillshare, the sponsor of today's video. If you don't know what Skillshare is already, Skillshare offers thousands of online inspiring classes for you lifelong learners, hobbyists, or working creatives. Skillshare has classes on anything like knitting, productivity, marketing, video editing, and so much more.
And I have been checking out the class DIY Filmmaking Creating Pro Video with tools you already own by Mark Searsasimo to find ways we can improve our video production without breaking the bank. Skillshare's classes are offered at any skill level, are ad-free, and they are always launching new premium classes. The first 1,000 people to use the link in our description will get a free trial of a Skillshare premium membership. Even without this deal, Skillshare is less than $10 per month with an annual subscription. Because of the size difference of our two countries, there was also a surprising difference when we watched the weather on TV in Germany. Very often when we see weather given in Germany, we see the entire country's weather given at once. Although we live in southwestern Germany, we often will also hear the weather for North Germany, South Germany, Central Germany, etc. before they get to the Southwest forecasts. There were times I saw this and thought, why are you giving me this information? And that is because of our experience with how weather is normally given in the US due to our country's size differences.
In the US, most of the weather we watch is given for the state or sometimes mainly just the greater city area. Weather given for the whole country is either very rare or given in only very specific circumstances. There are some national morning shows that may give a very brief peek into what the weather is for the country as a whole, and sometimes when there are massive storms rolling through parts of the country like hurricanes or huge blizzards that are big news stories, the whole country might be aware of that. But normally, you don't ever hear what the weather is in other parts of the country.
Now, there are also exceptions to these, and in Germany, we do sometimes see the local weather only given, but more often than not, we see the country-wide weather much more often than we would in the US. Part of this is also due to the fact that in the US, small local news stations are some of the main sources of news rather than large national news stations like in Germany. These small local news stations that each city or part of a state will cover local news primarily and therefore just focus on their area's weather. Even for states like Texas that are very large, it was rare when we lived there to see the weather for the entire state. Because it is so big, they would just focus on portions of the state that are most relevant to the viewer most of the time.
One of the main focuses of our channel is supposed to be travel, but that has had to shift because of the world situation. But in our travels, we did learn the way Americans perceive distance for traveling is also generally very different from a German's perspective. Donnie and I both went to college in Texas, and my university was about 5 to 6 hours away from home, and Donnie's was a little farther south, about 7 to 8 hours from home. And just for perspective on the size of these two states, it was about 2.5 hours to Texas from our hour home, then another 5 hours to Donnie's university. Yet he had friends who would drive 8 hours south from the university to go home and still never leave the state. However, it wasn't out of the question or uncommon for us to sometimes pop home for the weekend and make that 12 to 14 hour round trip drive. Donnie's parents even had season tickets to his university's football games, and that sometimes meant they would make that drive for the weekend 3 or 4 weeks in a row and up to 8 or 9 times in the fall.
When I studied abroad in college and lived with a German host family, I remember specifically talking about traveling home from college and how often we make drives like that versus what they would do. My understanding was that for them, it wasn't very common to travel home from university because of the distance, even though it was only maybe 4.5 hours away. This isn't just unique to traveling home for college though. Overall, it does seem that Americans are more used to things being much more spread out across the country, and therefore we are used to having to travel long distances to get where we want to go. Like we mentioned, Oklahoma is half the size of Germany, yet only has 2 major cities and only 1/22nd the population of Germany. These 2 factors help explain just how much less dense and spread out everything is in the US versus in Germany. Because we are used to driving long distances for short trips, we have driven from where we are near the French border to the Spreewald near the border of Poland, a 7-hour journey for us just for a weekend visit, and our German friends look at us like we are nuts. For a German to take these kinds of trips, we normally hear for them to go that far, they would need much more time at that destination to make it worth it. I would say that there is a limit to how far an American is willing to travel for a short trip, and maybe those 7 to 8 hour drives for a weekend is pushing that limit, but generally speaking, an American's idea of having to travel far is much farther than a German's perceptions of traveling far. But we want to know from you guys and see if this difference generally is true. Tell us in the comments how far you are generally willing to go for a short weekend trip, or how many days you usually plan for a trip that is more than, let's say, 5 hours of traveling time, and let us know where you were from.
So far, we have been talking about the obvious differences about the literal size of our 2 countries and our perceptions on size and distance based on what we grew up used to. These differences also primarily have to do with how much larger the US is than Germany, but there is one thing that Germany definitely has a difference in perception in the opposite direction, and that is in the perception on history. There's a major difference in German history and American history in terms of length. The US became a country only in 1776, but some people might be surprised to find that it is actually an older country than the country of Germany that we know today. The country of Germany as we know it has only been a country since 1990, or you could say when the German Empire was first established in 1871. Now this is a little misleading, and I can definitely attest to the fact that German history is extremely fascinating, but also extremely complicated when it comes to considering all of the different maps, empires, tribes, etc. through history. But history in the US and history in Germany have 2 very different meanings.
In the US, particularly the part where we are from, things that are old are actually very young compared to Germany. Oklahoma only became a state in 1907, and the oldest building in Oklahoma was only built in 1844. Most of the time when we are in buildings, even in the historic ones, they may only be 100 to 150 years old maximum, but most are new construction. Therefore, the size of history that we can feel, touch, and experience really isn't that great compared to where we live now. Just like in Germany, where history didn't just start in 1871, 1990, or whatever date you choose, history didn't just start in the US in 1776. We do have a ton of fascinating Native American history, and in fact, the oldest buildings in America can be found in the southwestern US that were built by the Pueblo people around 750 AD. But those are mostly just archaeological sites. However, here in Germany, it is super common to walk past buildings or even homes people still live in that will have dates inscribed on them that are 300, 400, 500 years or older. Even when we see a building that is from the 1700s and predates the US as a country, we stop and go, wow, where a German might go, I mean, that one right there is from 1450, so from our perception and reality, it is crazy to think that our country's forefathers who built the buildings we think are historic and ancient would come to Europe, and the buildings here would have been the same age for them as the ones we are fawning over in the US.
Our world perception and reality was solely based on the environment we grew up in, and we didn't realize how different our reality was from others in the world until we got out of it to see the world from other perspectives. The biggest lesson we have taken from differences like these is that our worldview is based on our experiences, and just like we grew up with the US being a normal-sized country and distance perception being one way, does not mean that everybody's perception and experiences are the same. It actually is really exciting once we are able to find these different perceptions, because then we get to look at the world in a whole new way.
We have misjudged distances as well, like when we traveled to Australia and greatly underestimated the size of that country. And we have heard of people who have planned road trips in the US and didn't realize how truly spread out everything is. Do you have any experiences where you realized distances were either seen differently or you misjudged it on a trip? Let us know in the comments below. We hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please hit that like and subscribe button, and also comment below what your favorite ice cream flavor is. I know that's not related to this video, but I'm just interested in seeing who actually made it this far. We will see you in our next video.
Cheers!
I have roast beef in my teeth. Oh well, you're up.
Oh.
That were built by the Pueblo people.
Pueblo people?
Pueblo people.
Pueblo people.
Pueblo people. Pueblo people. Okay.
Sorry.